Hi everybody, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur. I hope you're doing well. I hope you're having a great week. We had graduation at my high school last night, which was a wonderful ceremony. I love graduation ceremonies. It's fantastic to see the amount of emotion and passion and love that surrounds each kid who walks across that stage. Even when we only can have, 4 guests per graduate and they're grouped in little pods all around the field, the amount of cheering, the amount of just joy that we experience and get to share in is always wonderful. And then here in the desert, right at the end of the ceremony, it started lightly raining. So it was just a glorious graduation ceremony. But I also want to talk about Gilead by Marilynne Robinson, a fantastic book, one I highly recommend anyone to read. It's a justifiable Pulitzer Prize winner. I was reading it for the Maybemidrash Fiction Challenge, and I really enjoyed it. I will add that there are certain aspects of my experiences, my upbringing, that have formed me into an ideal type of reader for this book. I don't want to say the ideal type, but an ideal type of reader for this book. But I did enjoy it. It is beautifully written. It takes the form of an extended memoir meditation series of letters from a dying father to the son that he knows he's never going to see grow up. He's never going to see become a young man, become potentially a parent, a father of his own. And Reverend Ames, this main character, as he's writing, he is acutely aware of the impermanence in life, not just the impermanence of his own life, and knowing that the heart condition that could end his life at any moment, but the impermanence of all life, the impermanence of the church building he has preached in for decades, that it's dilapidated, and that when he dies, the congregation is going to tear it down and build a new building. He talks several times, he references the idea that he has just like loads of sermons from all these past years of ministry that someone will probably burn when he dies. And so there's this impermanence, and he wants to leave something lasting for his son. Not necessarily advice, but almost a context for the path he has chosen, in life. And so it sprawls. It's a fascinating sprawl where we're finding out about his father and grandfather and their experiences, which dates back, it's set in the 1950s. Reverend Ames is, I believe, 76 when it begins. So it sprawls all the way back to his grandfather being an active and violent abolitionist and part of the Bloody Kansas movement with folks like John Brown, all the way up to the 1950s, where he is seeing how much society has changed, but understanding as well that there are certain aspects that have not changed. And there's an interesting theme that becomes introduced that I'll try to talk about later. But it really is wonderfully written. There's some beautiful passages where Reverend Ames is trying to tell his young son about how he met this boy's mother, for the first time after his first wife had passed away. And then years later, he meets this new woman and gradually falls in love with her. And just what that romance was like. And it's wonderful. The writing has a cadence to it. It feels like we are dipping into this slow current that we drift with. Not unlike the writing of Virginia Woolf. And like the writing of Virginia Woolf, despite it feeling like a slow, gradual cadence, it allows us to really pay attention to everything that's in the book, everything that Ames is trying to share with us. So, as an example, all that is fine, but it's your existence I love you for, mainly. Existence seems to me now the most remarkable thing that could ever be imagined. I'm about to put on imperishability. In an instant, in the twinkling of an eye. The twinkling of an eye, that is the most wonderful expression. I've thought from time to time it was the best thing in life. That little incandescence you see in people when the charm of a thing strikes them, or the humor of it. The light of the eyes rejoiceth the heart. That's a fact. And so you can see where it's this consciousness that wanders, but then drifts back on course. Another example. I realize there is nothing more astonishing than a human face. Boughton and I have talked about that too. It has something to do with incarnation. You feel your obligation to a child when you have seen it and held it. Any human face is a claim on you, because you can't help but understand the singularity of it, the courage and loneliness of it. But this is truest of the face of an infant. I consider that to be one kind of vision, as mystical as any. And so there's just this wonderful sense to the book. And Reverend Ames is an enjoyable companion, even when he's talking about tragedies, the death of a child, the violent consequences of racism that exist, all the way back in his grandfather's time and that still exists now. In particular with one character who's introduced, that all of those consequences, Ames is constantly trying to sort of, explain his path forward and to a certain extent justify his path forward to his son. And so I really enjoyed it. Now, it was interesting that there are sort of two characters who act as, I want to say, almost like alternate ends of this spectrum for Reverend Ames himself. There's his grandfather who pursued a violent path, preached like wearing a bloody shirt at one point, and who he views, his father and he himself sort of have rejected that idea. But his grandfather was, fighting to free the slaves. And that's a noble cause. And he recognized that, but he feels that the violence is not the path he can take. And then on the other side, we have Jack Boughton, the youngest son of the Presbyterian minister in the same town, who is named for Reverend Ames and who acts as a sort of prodigal son who feels like almost a Mephistopheles type character when he's introduced. And the Reverend Ames wants to warn his son, wants to warn his wife about Jack and the dark things that happen around Jack, the way Jack can be deceitful, the way he's manipulative, the people he's hurt in very real and like scary ways. And gradually, as Jack and Reverend Ames have these conversations, we learn more and more, and we see the consequences that still exist in 1950s U.S. Around racism, and the idea specifically around marriage between the races, which was not legal at the time in Iowa, in Missouri, in many of the states, including Arizona, where I live now. It may have been legal in Iowa. I'm not entirely sure about that, but I know it wasn't legal here in Arizona. It wasn't in Missouri. So, and so that becomes this really interesting counterpoint to frame the path that Reverend Ames is continuing to pursue forward. And I thought that was really interesting. I do want to close with one last reading, and then I'll talk a little bit about why I sort of felt this was a book that, I was an ideal type of reader for. So it goes, theologians talk about a prevenient grace that precedes grace itself and allows us to accept it. I think there must also be a prevenient courage that allows us to be brave, that is, to acknowledge that there is more beauty than our eyes can bear, that precious things have been put into our hands, and to do nothing to honor them is to do great harm. And therefore, this courage, as the old man said, to make ourselves useful. It allows us to be generous, which is another way of saying exactly the same thing. And so I appreciate that. It dovetailed so well with reading Paul Tillich's The Courage to Be, and that idea of, Tillich doesn't express it in here, but in another book or article he had written, this idea around providence is this idea that there is a creative solution to any situation that no event can destroy. And that feels what Reverend Ames is trying to find, is as he realizes the tragedies that have enfolded Jack Boughton's life, that have enfolded his own life. He's trying to find the providence. He's trying to find this solution, and believing that the solution might be out of his hands, but that it still exists. And so as long as he can just continue to try to be present when a solution will present itself, that's really almost all he can do, and to try and make himself useful, whatever that means, even as he's in his last months, his last year. So it was really a wonderful and enjoyable book to read. Now, as someone who grew up in a small Christian congregation, who still attends church, who has conversations around religion with my daughters and my wife, this was a book where I was like, oh yeah, I know what he's talking about, where he references certain ideas around Calvinism that are perhaps atypical from what many believe around predestination, or believe around sort of like Calvinism without ever reading John Calvin's Institutes. So that was really fascinating. I was like, oh, we've had those conversations around like our dinner table or my grandparents' dinner table, so that was fascinating. But particularly as well as, you know, my wife and I being in a marriage that would not have been legal in Arizona at the time this book is set, or in many other states in the U.S., and sort of seeing thankfully, how far we've come in many ways. That, of course, was an aspect that spoke to me. What I was describing certain aspects of the plot to my wife, and she looked at me like, wait, what? So I do recommend reading this book. I think many people would enjoy it. I'm very curious to read more of the books within this Gilead sequence. Home, Lila, even Jack. So I'm certainly curious to read those. Other writers, though, that it reminded me of, certainly that sense of consciousness felt not just Virginia Woolf, but William Faulkner. Some of the ideas around religion, the ideas around grace, the ideas around forgiveness, the idea around the idea that the people who are most holy are still imperfect, reminded me of my favorite short story by Tolstoy, Father Sergius. And then the beautiful cadence that Reverend Ames' voice takes reminds me somewhat of Duck's Newburyport. In Duck's Newburyport, it's the fact that is this refrain that always tells us we're about to like shift to some new idea. And in Gilead, it's this, I want to tell you about, or, well, I should remind you that, that reminds us to redirect that, yes, this is this extended long-form letter and series of letters to a son. A couple of other quick references. While I was reading Gilead, I read a couple of the old sermons from the 18th century by Jonathan Edwards, which are interesting. And then John Donne as well is referenced. And Isaac Watts' poetry, including some of the translations of the Psalms, were referenced as well. So, Gilead, highly recommend it. And again, I hope everybody's doing well. Let me know if you've read Gilead, if there's a favorite of Robinson's novels that you would highly recommend. You know, should I read Home next? So, thanks everybody.